If you are a 70-year-old Afghan, you have lived through about a half a dozen different types of rule. The liberal King Zahir Shah, the Soviets, the Mujahideen, the Taliban, and the US-backed Afghan government. And that's just federally speaking. For many, that turnover in Afghanistan has been accompanied by the inability for real systemic change to be created for the people. Now, on the precipice of a complete US withdrawal that would end the US's longest military engagement and see foreign forces nearly completely out of Afghanistan for the first time in 20 years, the lucky Afghans are preparing for what could be next. Could the Taliban take back power, and will the country be thrown into yet another civil war? The unlucky Afghans have already had some insight into that answer. Since the withdrawal began in May, the Taliban has been rapidly taking back territory, conquering important roads, borders, and cities, and effectively instilling the knowledge that wherever Afghans travel, they will have to deal with the Taliban. Thousands of homes have already been conquered by the armed group, who says they control 85% of Afghan territory, a figure that the government denies. Their advancements have displaced thousands into all too familiar makeshift refugee camps, where, in places like Kandahar, the former capital of the Taliban in the 90s, IDPs are not only dealing with the trauma of fleeing, but the understanding that if the advancements continue at the same pace, they will unquestionably have to flee again. But that's only part of the troubling reality. The Afghan Defense Forces, now left to fight against the Taliban on their own, are in deep need of logistical support. Commanders say they have the will and the manpower, but a lack of air support, for which the Taliban has no defense against, has forced them to fight harder on the ground, where resources like ammonium, infrastructure, and salaries are running low. These issues come on top of an already deteriorating security situation in the country. In the 20 years since the US-led foreign coalition invaded, not only do people say the Taliban has grown stronger, but so have several other armed militias who now want a piece of the pie in Afghanistan. On top of that list, Daesh. They have a murky relationship with the Taliban, but have had no issue independently instilling fear into the people, particularly those within Afghanistan's Hazara community. Having faced discrimination for decades, Daesh has ramped up attacks against them, most recently killing 85 in a girls' school bombing in May. In the following series, we take you through Roya's journey in Afghanistan, where we take an in-depth look at each of these issues through the eyes of the Afghan people who desperately want their voices to be heard. It's day 2 here in Afghanistan, and we're now at the second front line, which is here in Chelzina. We've just chatted with some of the Afghan soldiers and also a commander. And now I just want you to get a picture of exactly how close we are to the Taliban forces, because those homes right up there are inhabited by Taliban. And honestly, getting here, we actually took a wrong turn and ended up in Taliban-held areas. From the hotel, it's about 5 kilometers away. So just for you to get an understanding of how close they are into Kandahar city, you know, they haven't exactly penetrated the city yet, but when you're that close, it's really a tough line to be able to say that they have or have not gotten inside. Afghan forces all over the country are battling the Taliban, many in provinces that haven't historically experienced such fighting, such as in the north of the country. But according to most, there is no province as important as Kandahar, the 90s stronghold of the Taliban and home to the second biggest city in the country, also named Kandahar. For months, Afghans have said, if Kandahar falls, Afghanistan will fall. It was the first city Roya visited in Afghanistan, and it provided perhaps the most clear picture of the reality on the ground. At the 2 front lines we visited, there was no denying the vulnerability of the Afghan forces. On the first front line, perched on a hillside between 2 mountaintops, soldiers and commanders stood beside the rubble of a checkpoint and police station, which just 5 days earlier the Taliban had blown up, killing several and destroying their only defense infrastructure, making them highly sensitive to nightly raids and sniper attacks. According to the commander, in his 20 years in the forces, Afghan districts have never been lost so rapidly, which he says is due, in part, to a quick withdrawal of foreign forces and the money, training, and equipment that went with them. A lack of coordination between the government, military, and police, and continued tribal issues have also played a part. At the second front line, beneath a heavily fortified mountaintop where non-stop shelling could be heard, soldiers spoke of similar issues, but insisted again that if it was simply a matter of groundwork and will, they could take back the districts in a heartbeat, similar to how the US did in 2001. But as local forces, they're closer to the issue, and they say that means protecting civilians at all costs.
So we're just speaking with an Afghan army commander here on the front line in Chelzina, and I had asked him what the biggest vulnerability here is. And he said our biggest vulnerability isn't any sort of resource, but the understanding that we will not go in and shoot any sort of innocent civilians in Taliban areas, despite the fact that this is an advice from the US that we should. They're saying, Talibs hide out in madrasas, in schools, in mosques, and despite the fact that if we could kill 100 of them, we will not do that if it sacrifices the life of even one innocent Afghan.
The commander tells us that in spite of these vulnerabilities, even if he is blown to pieces by the Taliban, he will be proud as he is serving his country. Now, the Afghan government has a very different narrative regarding the forces and their capacities, saying that the joint coordination between the military and the police has been solved, and that the Afghan forces are more than ready to step up and defeat the Taliban. But, he admits, air support and modern equipment are needed, and that the amount of civilian casualties and families displaced by recent fighting is worrying. In the last 2 months, over 20,000 families in Kandahar alone had been displaced, with 500 civilians killed in that week, and 200 missing from the Spin Boldak border crossing with Pakistan, which had recently been overtaken by the Taliban. But as I grew to learn, statistics alone couldn't nearly grasp the horrors that the Afghan IDPs are living in. Join us tomorrow as we talk with those displaced in the country about their most pressing needs and who it is that they look to remedy their situation. In most refugee camps, one would imagine small bungalows or, at the very least, some sort of tents. In the 3 refugee camps we visited in the Kandahar province of Afghanistan, there were no such thing. In all 3, most people only had been at the makeshift camp for a total of 5 days, a testament to the ongoing fighting and just how ever-evolving the situation is. For most, it wasn't their first experience with displacement. Several experienced it regularly throughout their lives, through the several occupations, invasions, and subsequent infighting in the country.
We had nothing else, just our clothes in our this big, small bag. Then we can.
Many share the same concerns, providing for their families and understanding why the Taliban has evolved into the force seen today. Because people have only been in the camps for such a short period of time, the government has not yet caught up with offering all the services that need to be available. 2 of the camps we visited were schools not being used for the summer holiday.
It really is, when I say a school, I mean a school. I mean that classes are off for 3 months, and the Afghan government told the director of the school, that means this place is now going to be a place where IDPs are coming. It is a school. There are no showers, there is no cafeteria, there are no increased bathrooms or any sort of extra facilities offered. It is a school, and people are having to make do with that, whether that means 9 families in a room sleeping on the floor. And of course, you put a bunch of random strangers in the same room together, and that does mean there's going to be fighting, there's going to be disagreements, and people are just having to put up with that because, and I really want to stress this here, there are no other options.
One of the camps was a mere kilometer from the front line with the Taliban. The last camp was inside the walls of a government compound. IDPs were allowed to lay on a plastic carpet on the grounds of the compound, but not inside the building, meaning they had virtually no protection against the sweltering Afghan summer. People were forced to make do with what they have, or what they were offered. In one of the camps, a young activist doctor makes regular medical donations, saying to her it's a form of women's activism. She too provides insight on what several IDPs echoed to me. The concern with the Taliban is not that they would force women to cover. We're Muslim, she says. If they want us to cover, we'll cover. But that they disallow women the basic freedom of movement, which has proven necessary to the security and stability of the nation, especially in crisis. In general, rights come from cultural expectations. We want the rights Islam grants us. Men cannot take them. Islam's rights will bring us prosperity, not democracy, she says. Despite the conditions of the camp, conditions in the governmental hospital 5 kilometers down the road are much worse.
We just finished a tour of Midway's Nika Hospital here in Kandahar. It is the only governmental hospital, so there are 3 or 4 provinces that mainly feed into this hospital, but depending on the amount of violence, it could be anywhere up to, 11 or 12 different villages. And honestly, I've never seen these kinds of injuries before. You see children on breathing devices, gunshot wounds. There's even a chart on the hospital wall that says how many gunshot wounds there are, how many, war-inflicted wounds there are. And the doctors are saying, they're just expecting more to come.
We spoke to the brother of 18-year-old Noor Ahmed, a tailor who had been shot that very morning while riding his bike. His village is in disputed territory between the Afghan Forces and the Taliban, and he doesn't know who shot him. In fact, that was what several patients said. I don't know who shot me, and that's why I don't care who runs the government. I just want peace.
What's interesting is a lot of the IDPs, internally displaced people, Afghanistan actually has one of the highest rates in the world of IDPs, though we don't generally think of Afghanistan having a high amount of refugees. They indeed do. A lot of them are saying, we don't care if the bullet is from the Taliban. We don't care if the bullet is from the Afghan Forces. The point is that it's a bullet, and we need peace, and we need our youth to stop dying.
The head surgeon at the hospital said that for now, they've been able to keep pace with the injuries, but with cases exponentially increasing, that won't last for long. All he can do is keep putting in the work for his country and hope that the fighting stops soon. The current situation in Afghanistan does not live apart from the issues that the country was experiencing prior to the U.S. withdrawal. Unemployment, the coronavirus crisis, the devaluation of the local currency, and security concerns have plagued the country for decades. At the top of the list of concerns are the strength of military groups. Nearly every person I spoke to said that there have never been more active militias in the country than there are today, which many say is the result of the botched foreign invasion and support from neighboring Pakistan, with which Afghanistan has a touchy relationship with. Among the most active armed groups in the country apart from the Taliban is Daesh, and according to recent estimates, the group could have nearly 10,000 fighters inside Afghanistan, distributed in all provinces. Their mark on the country is evidenced by recent attacks. During Eid al-Adha, the group fired rockets into the presidential palace compound. While the rockets caused no injuries or material damage, it was a show of both force and brutality that expressed that even on the holiest of days, they would not stop stoking fear in the Afghan people. In May, Daesh targeted a girls' school in Kabul's predominantly Hazara neighborhood, killing 85 and instilling the notion that the Hazara community, long targeted outside of Kabul, would not even be safe inside the city. While shooting footage in Kabul's Babur Garden, we met a 36-year-old Hazara shopkeeper named Wahida, who told her about her experiences in Afghanistan's changing political climate in the last 20 years. Having been widowed and left to raise her daughters on her own, she speaks of the challenges presented not only by the Taliban, but the government's lack of support. In general, the government has not supported us. Otherwise, how would the Taliban be able to target us? I'm uncomfortable, depressed, mentally miserable. What will they do for me and my family, she asks. Despite her situation, and the fact that she says Hazara women in particular are targeted because of their hard work and grit, she remains intent that her daughters will see a better future. I won't allow my daughters to work. They're in school and they're learning English. I wasn't earning a lot, but when I needed money for my daughter's schooling, I sold one of my sewing machines just to ensure that they will continue their education. Other members of the community stress the same points. The situation is disastrous, but what is there to do? Freshta, a civil activist, says she wants nothing more than to stay in Afghanistan, but if the situation continues as is, she'll have no choice but to leave. And it's complicated, she says, as education is on the rise for women, but Afghanistan is only becoming less safe. Last May, while pregnant with her second child, the maternity ward she was in was attacked by Daesh, and she was forced to lock herself inside a bathroom with a doctor for hours. While recounting the horrid details of the attack, she shudders and says it's made her think twice about the kind of work she does, because it only makes her and her family that much less safe. Afghanistan has had a troubled past, and the decades of loss have scarred both the country and its people. But those scars are not innate, and violence is far from the spirit and heart of the country. People welcomed us with open arms, delighted that a foreign news crew wanted to know more about the rich and expansive Afghan culture, which is too often hidden behind worrisome news headlines. To sugarcoat their situation would be to be dismissive of the horrid circumstances they face, but to pretend that there couldn't be infinite possible futures for the country if it wasn't for the violence would be equally reductive. The Afghan people are ever deserving of the futures that were robbed from them, and it is their hope that those futures will be restored in this generation, who will, as they say, inshallah, see a brighter and united Afghanistan.